When we think about medieval soldiers, it's easy to imagine heroic knights in shining armor, charging into battle with swords raised and banners flying. Popular culture paints a romantic picture of honor, glory, and chivalry, but the reality of warfare in the Middle Ages was far more brutal, dirty, and unforgiving. Behind the legends and myths was a world where survival depended on physical endurance, mental toughness, and a high tolerance for pain, fear, and misery. The truth is, most modern people would not last a single day in the boots of a medieval soldier. The combination of poor living conditions, lack of proper medical care, relentless physical demands, and constant exposure to death and disease created an environment that broke people down quickly, both in body and in spirit. This was a time before modern training, nutrition, or even the most basic understanding of hygiene. Once you were thrown into the ranks, there was no turning back, and no guarantees of safety, comfort, or even a full meal. In this breakdown, we'll look closely at what made life as a medieval soldier so harsh and why it was one of the most punishing roles anyone could endure. From the weight of armor to the chaos of combat, from the threat of infection to the psychological toll of war, every part of the experience tested the limits of human endurance. It wasn't just about being brave or strong, it was about surviving the day. And for most people today, that simply wouldn't be possible. Number 1. No training for real combat. In the medieval world, the idea of a soldier receiving structured, professional military training the way modern armies do simply didn't exist. For most men, going to war was less about preparation and more about being forced into service when conflict erupted. The majority of fighters in a medieval army were not warriors by trade, but peasants pulled from farms or laborers from towns. These men were handed basic weapons, often spears, axes, or crude swords, and thrown into battle lines with minimal instruction. In many cases, their only training was watching others fight or swinging a stick around in their spare time. There were no manuals, no physical conditioning programs, and no trainers walking them through tactics. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to be learning how to hold a weapon properly on the very same day they were expected to kill with it. Even among those who had some experience, such as men-at-arms or retainers serving under a lord, the level of combat readiness varied wildly. These individuals may have participated in skirmishes or previous campaigns, but their preparation often came down to luck, exposure, and personal discipline rather than a formal curriculum. Knights, who are often imagined as elite warriors, were indeed trained from a young age, but that training focused heavily on jousting, horsemanship, and personal combat in controlled environments. That didn't always translate well to the chaos and unpredictability of real battlefields, where formations collapsed, visibility was poor, and survival hinged more on instinct than etiquette. The physical and mental demands were staggering. Most people today aren't used to the sheer exhaustion that comes from wearing armor for hours while carrying heavy gear and fighting in close quarters. The mental toll of being surrounded by noise, blood, and death without warning or guidance only added to the difficulty. Simply put, medieval warfare was not something you could casually step into and hope to figure out as you went. Number 2, your body would collapse under the weight. The physical burden placed on a medieval soldier was far beyond what most people today are capable of enduring, and it started with the sheer weight of the equipment they had to carry on a daily basis. A basic set of chainmail could easily weigh between 30 and 50 pounds, depending on its length and the quality of the metal. But that was only part of the load. When you added a metal helmet, a wooden shield reinforced with iron, a sword or axe, a dagger, maybe a spear, and whatever personal belongings they could carry, food, water, maybe a small bag of coins or tools, the total could climb to over 60 pounds, all of it strapped to your body from early morning until nightfall. Now imagine moving with all of that across rough, unforgiving terrain. Medieval soldiers didn't march on paved roads or level ground. Most of the time they were pushing through muddy fields, uneven forest paths, rocky hills, and soaked riverbanks. Sometimes they were on their feet for 10 to 12 hours a day, under burning sun or freezing rain, often without proper footwear. Many didn't even have boots, just thin leather shoes that wore down quickly. Socks weren't common, so blisters and infections were part of life. There were no painkillers, no changes of clothes, and no one coming to help if your feet gave out. You had to keep up with the unit no matter what shape you were in. The body breaks down quickly under those conditions, especially when rest is limited and food is basic. Heat exhaustion, muscle strain, and dehydration could hit fast, but there were no medics to check on you, no one monitoring your health. If your armor began to chafe and break the skin, you just dealt with it. If your shoulders started to burn from carrying a shield all day, you didn't get relief. You just kept going. Falling behind meant becoming a liability, and no army could afford to carry the weak. In many cases, those who couldn't keep pace were simply abandoned. Number 3, disease was more dangerous than weapons. When people imagine the dangers of medieval warfare, they usually think of blades clashing and arrows flying, but the reality was far more grim. Disease was what truly killed the most. Conditions in medieval military camps were ideal for the rapid spread of illness, and soldiers lived shoulder to shoulder in crowded, filthy environments with no real access to sanitation or medical care. Hygiene wasn't just neglected, it was almost non-existent. Bathing was rare, often considered a luxury or even a risk in some places, and clean clothing was difficult to come by. Dirty water, spoiled food, and constant exposure to human waste created a breeding ground for infections that moved through the ranks quickly and without mercy. Latrines, if they existed at all, were nothing more than open pits dug in the ground, and they were often placed dangerously close to the sources of drinking water. This led to constant contamination, and as a result, waterborne diseases like dysentery spread fast and could weaken or kill a soldier in a matter of days. On top of that, lice and fleas were everywhere, spreading fevers and bringing the risk of typhus, which was common and often fatal. Rats infested tents and supply wagons, carrying additional threats like plague. And because there was almost no understanding of how illness spread, nothing effective was done to prevent it. Injury in battle often wasn't the end of your problems, it was the beginning. Even a small wound could become deadly if it became infected, which was a constant risk given the lack of sterilization and the filthy conditions. There were no antibiotics, no disinfectants, and battlefield surgery was done with crude tools and no anesthesia. If a wound turned bad, the only option was to cut off the limb, and that procedure itself was often fatal due to shock or blood loss. Once disease took hold in a camp, it could wipe out entire units without a single arrow being fired. Number 4, the food would break you. The nutritional reality of a medieval soldier's life was harsh and relentless, and most people today wouldn't last long under the same conditions. There were no balanced meals, no reliable food supply, and certainly no knowledge of dietary needs or hydration. Soldiers ate whatever was available, which often meant rations that were difficult to chew, hard to digest, and severely lacking in nutrients. One of the most common staples was a dry, rock-hard bread known as hardtack, which was so tough it sometimes had to be soaked in liquid just to avoid breaking your teeth. Alongside that, dried and heavily salted meat was distributed when available, but it was far from pleasant or fresh, and certainly not enough to keep your strength up for long. Fresh vegetables and fruits were rare, especially during campaigns. A lucky soldier might get onions or garlic, which were used more for their preservative and supposed medicinal properties than for taste. These meals provided very little in terms of actual energy, and because the food was carried from place to place, it often spoiled before it could be eaten, leaving soldiers with moldy bread or rancid meat. The longer a campaign dragged on, the worse the quality became, and when rations ran out, soldiers were expected to forage, steal from nearby villages, or go hungry. The problem extended beyond food to what they drank. Clean water was difficult to find and often avoided because it could make you sick. Instead, soldiers relied on weak ale, which was safer due to the brewing process, but it didn't hydrate well and couldn't replace the fluids lost during long marches and heavy combat. When you add up the poor nutrition, irregular meals, and physically demanding lifestyle, malnutrition set in fast. Energy levels dropped, immune systems weakened, and recovery from wounds or exhaustion became nearly impossible. For anyone used to regular meals and clean water, the medieval soldier's diet would be a fast track to collapse. Number 5. The violence was incomprehensible. The brutality of medieval warfare is often diluted in modern depictions, but the truth is that the violence was overwhelming, relentless, and intensely personal. Unlike today's distant forms of combat, medieval battles forced men into close quarters where killing was not only face-to-face, but physically exhausting. There were no firearms or long-range safety. Every blow had to be delivered by hand, whether with a sword, axe, mace, or spear. You had to step into someone's space, feel the resistance of their body, and hear the sounds of pain and panic all around you. There was no such thing as a clean kill. The weapons weren't designed to dispatch quickly. They were meant to maim, crush, or pierce in ways that left lasting damage, and survival often came down to who was faster, stronger, or simply luckier. In the middle of battle, formations often fell apart once the clash began. What was supposed to be an organized line of soldiers quickly turned into a chaotic and deadly struggle for survival. Visibility was poor due to dust, blood, and shouting men pressing in from every side. The air was filled with the sound of metal hitting bone, shields splintering, men groaning or screaming, and orders shouted that no one could hear over the noise. You couldn't stop to think. Every second of hesitation put you at risk, and the longer the fight dragged on, the harder it was to even lift your weapon. Adrenaline carried you for a while, but exhaustion set in quickly, and with it came mistakes, and mistakes were fatal. Mentally, the trauma of this kind of combat was impossible to ignore. Soldiers weren't just fighting strangers. Often they faced people who spoke their language, looked like them, and fought with the same desperation. There was no time to process what you were doing. You killed, moved on, and did it again, whether you wanted to or not. And even if you survived, you carried the images and the weight of it long after the battle was over. Number 6. Siege warfare was psychological torture. While open battle was physically exhausting and immediately dangerous, life during a medieval siege brought a different kind of suffering. Slow, persistent, and deeply psychological. Whether you were trapped inside a besieged fortress or camped outside as part of the attacking force, the experience tested the limits of human endurance in ways that went far beyond the battlefield. For those defending, a siege meant confinement, uncertainty, and the gradual breakdown of basic human needs. As the days dragged on, food supplies diminished quickly, water sources became unsafe or dried up, and the spread of disease accelerated in the cramped and unsanitary conditions of a packed castle. People were forced to ration moldy bread or eat things no human should, and the strong often took more than their share, leaving the weak to fade. Inside the walls, the constant tension created a heavy atmosphere of fear and despair. You could hear the enemy outside, digging, shouting, taunting, preparing, but you had no control over when or how they would strike. Bombardments from siege engines could happen at any hour, sometimes destroying homes or crushing people in their sleep. Fire arrows set roofs ablaze, and there were instances where invaders hurled disease-ridden corpses over the walls to spread panic and infection. Watching friends or family die slowly from hunger or illness without being able to help left deep emotional scars and shattered morale. People began to break down mentally, turning on one another, questioning leadership, and in extreme cases, even resorting to cannibalism in pure desperation. On the other side, life in the siege camps wasn't much better. Soldiers lived in filth, exposed to the elements with little shelter and limited food of their own. Sanitation was poor, disease was rampant, and morale could fall just as fast. Constant readiness was required because the defenders could launch sudden sorties at any time, and the longer the siege dragged on, the more the waiting itself became a form of torment. And when the siege finally ended, if surrender wasn't given, the attackers often showed no mercy. What followed was a full-scale assault where anyone inside, including civilians, could be slaughtered. Surviving a siege didn't mean walking away unharmed, it meant carrying the trauma for the rest of your life. Number 7. There was no exit strategy. One of the most overlooked and brutal aspects of being a medieval soldier was that there was no such thing as a clear endpoint to your service. Once you were drawn into the demands of war, whether by feudal obligation, local conscription, or economic desperation, there was no structured path out. There were no contracts that guaranteed a return date, no system of rotation, and certainly no formal retirement. You stayed in the army until your lord released you, the campaign ended, or your body gave out. If you were severely wounded and could no longer fight, you were often sent away without care, left to survive on your own, without compensation or medical support. Physical injuries that today might require surgery or long-term rehabilitation were simply left to heal on their own, if they healed at all. Those who tried to escape service by deserting faced severe punishment, including public execution. The idea of abandoning your post was treated as betrayal, both to your commander and to the structure that held the army together. The punishment was often cruel and meant to be a warning to others. As a result, many men were trapped in an endless cycle of marching, fighting, and suffering. The longer you served, the more your body broke down. Continuous exposure to cold, poor nutrition, repeated injuries, and exhaustion wore soldiers out faster than age ever could. Bones didn't set right, wounds reopened with effort, and head trauma from blunt weapons left many with long-term cognitive damage. And even if you made it through a campaign and returned home, there was no welcome committee waiting. Most returning soldiers were not seen as heroes, but as laborers expected to return to the fields or trades as if nothing had changed. No one asked what you'd seen, how you'd changed, or whether you could still function. The psychological damage, what today would be recognized as PTSD, was often expressed through silence, aggression, or detachment, but society offered no space for healing. You were simply used up, and when your usefulness ended, you were forgotten.